Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Ukrainian, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The back and forth in the south continues, where the Russians manage to gain control over a settlement along the Vovcha River and continue their advances in the northern flank of Uliapole. In turn, the Ukrainians managed to recapture some fortified positions here in the Zaporizhia region. To the northeast, the Russians continued advances within the Luhansk region, closing in on gaining full control of it, and additional advances by the Russians along the border section between the Belgorod and Sumy region, as well as the Kursk and Sumy region. Starting out in the south, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over several fortified positions in the vicinity of Lukyanivske, as well as the remaining parts of Novoyakovlivka and the fortified positions on the southern outskirts of the town, reaching the outskirts of Pavlivka along the main sector. The Ukrainians are here working on regaining control over the fortifications in the vicinity of Stepnohirsk to regain access into the town and cut off the supplies to the Russian forces along the defensive line, while at the same time advancing towards Pavlivka, which is the alternative supply line to the Russian forces along the fortifications, by advancing directly from the north. So additional advances by the Russians working at cutting off the logistics of the Russian forces operating along the first line of defense and in the rear of it. By cutting off the logistics to the fortifications, the Ukrainians would put heavy pressure on the Russian forces along these fortifications. If they regain control of them, they'll have a defensive line to make use of to defend against Russian offensive operations in the vicinity of Stepnohirsk. Therefore, the added pressure on the fortifications in the area is an advantageous position for the Ukrainians, as they are storming the fortifications from their weak spot, that is the northern direction, while the fortifications are facing the southern direction, and at the same time attacking the supply lines of the Russians, which do not have a proper buffer zone or defensive positions to the north of them that will defend these supply lines. The Ukrainians are taking advantage of the situation and pushing through at the weak spot of the Russian forces, attempting to cut off the supplies, weakening the positions, and then regaining control of them, which will significantly improve the positions of their forces here along the defensive line. However, the Russians continue their own offensive operations to the east, where they managed to regain control over Kosivtseve, which the Ukrainians attempted to push into from the south, gaining a foothold. The Russians now kicked them back out of the town as they continued operations to cut off the Ukrainian counterattack aiming at Dobropilya, which would be aiming at cutting off the supplies to the Russian forces operating within Ternovate, Rysyanka, Boykova, and the frontline positions along the second line of defense here in the northwest. The interesting part about a battle of attrition is the aim at destroying the enemy's ability to wage war. Now, the way they do this is by destroying the opponent's military, the equipment, and the soldiers. Either case, the equipment is destroyed in two ways: the industry that builds it and when it is delivered to the front. However, the most important one is the manpower, as it is something that is a much more finite resource than the equipment itself. With the massive industries of today's world, a lot of equipment can be made, but there is a low birth rate. So how is the effectiveness of destroying the manpower of a military? Well, the less equipment they have available at the front, the easier it is to destroy the manpower. And that is what the strain on the logistics is aiming at. The reason why both sides continuously strike the supply lines and target those is the fewer supplies that goes to the front, the weaker the manpower is, and therefore they'll be taking more casualties. So it is counterproductive in the sense of destroying the equipment itself, but it is aiming at cutting off the logistics, and therefore the manpower will take more casualties. And that is especially important in a war such as this one, where both sides are making a lot of weapons and relying on cheap drones. Therefore, the weapons are basically infinite, and the infantry is the limited resource that we are seeing. So both sides are interested in limiting the supplies to weaken the enemy soldiers, destroying them, which would have the impact on morale and the manpower resource. To the northeast of this, the Russians managed to regain control over Alexandrorad, which was under Ukrainian control for over half a year. The Russians initially pushed through bypassing Alexandrorad and gained control over additional settlements, while never actually recapturing the town, because it is a small town and the Ukrainians were able to properly resupply it with drones due to the limited size of the town, and around it there are open fields, which limited the ability of the Russian forces to go and get control of the town. Therefore, with this, the Russians have gained control over the last bridgehead the Ukrainians had across the Vovcha River, and now additional offensive operations will be continuing in the western direction to regain control over the fortifications here along the second line of defense and undo the results of the Ukrainian counterattack, which has happened over the past 2.5 months. Both sides are relying a lot on drones, both FPV drones and quadcopter drones, which are mainly used to resupply infantry near the front and attack those same infantry near the front. The objective is to clear the way to prevent direct strikes on advancing infantry and vehicles, but they are unable so far to deal with the drones due to the significant amount of drones being used at the front. With thousands of drones being used every single day, we're seeing this stalemate. So the real question is, who has the larger manpower pool to keep this war going and the political will to continue pulling from this manpower pool, and who's inflicting the most casualties on the manpower to see the longer term results of this war? We have to take a deeper look at that. However, this is a heavily confidential number, the infantry casualties and the manpower pool available and the political will, as both countries do not really release these. Well, no country really does so during wartime, so it is very complicated to make any sort of research on this without proper numbers. However, it is clear that both sides are willing to continue this war politically for a long time, as neither side has shown any large-scale demonstrations against the government's waging of the war, but rather on different parts. The war itself is fairly popular on both sides. The northeast of this, the Russians continue offensive operations along the Luhansk border section, where they managed to gain control over some forest lines leading up to Rekivka, with an attempt to regain control over the town, which is one of the final ones under Ukrainian control within the Luhansk region, where the only areas under Ukrainian control within the Luhansk region are some fortifications here in the border section between the Luhansk and Kharkiv sector of the front. A very small section including the towns of Rekivka, some fortifications, and what remains of Svedo-Hlebove here in the north. As for the border section and the international border, the Russians have managed to gain control over some forest patches here in the border section and the town of Prohody. The Russians here push across the border in areas where they have been launching operations recently, with the expansion of the offensive operations in the north along the month of March. They're expanding further south to connect with the operations that also took place during the month of March, and additional operations along the border gain control over wider areas of forest patches. Russians here are mainly working with infantry and drones, as they are in many sectors of the front, rarely using vehicles. The objective of the Russians here is to gain control over the forest patches, clear them of Ukrainian forces, and create a buffer zone along the border to prevent Ukrainian offensives into Russian territory in the future, and also to gain some square kilometers, which they, in a potential peace deal, can trade for positions within the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson region. If the Russians are able to gain full control over the Donetsk region and the majority of the Zaporizhia region, they can trade the northern territories with control over the southern territories. The operations by the Russians in the north include capturing some fortified positions along the border section and large areas of forest patches. After the capture of the international border crossing near the railway station and the town of Vysoka and Popivka in the northeast, the Russians infiltrating the Ukrainian positions along the forest patch areas. The Russians are likely using the soldiers that they had available in the Serebryansky forest area following the capture of it. The Serebryansky forest area was fought over for many years. After the Russians captured the majority of it, it freed up a lot of the soldiers they had available from the area, as not much more of forest fighting continues in this sector. Therefore, they had a lot of opportunities to gain a lot of experience and have then used that to gain control over forest patches in the north, where they have been much more successful in recent months compared to the former years of fighting. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.